It is Wednesday, May 9th, 2018, and this is Seahawks Chats with Kenneth Arthur. This is the podcast. This is the format in which myself, Kenneth Arthur, brings on someone to talk about the Seahawks. And you might say, it's not Seaside Chats, which is when I talk to a comedian about their favorite NFL team, and it's not 3000 NFL mock draft. But you could say that our guest today is a funny guy, so that counts for side chats. And you could say that he's aware of the draft and things that go on within it. So it could be that. But we're also going to talk about the Seahawks, which spans every episode of every show that we do here. So with me today is Ben Baldwin of Field Goals in the past, and now you can find him at The Athletic Seattle, one of the inaugural first wave of people to write for The Athletic Seattle, Ben Baldwin. And if you're on Twitter, you may know him for talking about running backs sometimes. So, that is for sure something, Ben, that has to be something now that is in your profile. It's one of the leaders of things about you. And do you think that's a fair assessment? Is that something that you're proud of to say, is that Ben Baldwin, running back hater, is something you're ready to wear with pride?
Yeah, I think that's, I don't know if I go so far as to say running back hater. I think that it's not that I think running backs aren't good. It's that there's so many good running backs in the NFL that they're mostly replaceable. And that's not a knock on them. It's just that it's such a talented position because that's the position that every athletic kid wants to play growing up. So by the time you get to the NFL, you just have such a deep pool of mostly replaceable running backs.
So give me something then in the last, 6 months, 6 weeks, 6 hours. Give me something about running backs that, if you could, because I feel like I feel that for myself, I've had the same opinion, for I don't know how long, but it's been quite a few years. As soon as I started to notice and people started to notice that running backs didn't go in the first round very often, it sort of started to turn on this thing. And is this the right thing to do? And sure enough, I've found that almost all evidence supports that it is the right thing to do. But I also felt that after the Seahawks drafted Rashad Penny, and trust me, like I feel like I already can sense that I was trying to find a silver lining to drafting a running back in the first round for the Seahawks after all these years of saying don't draft a running back in the first round ever. But I did feel like, oh, okay, if they're doing it from a value standpoint of saying this guy is going to be paid like the number 20 or the number 25 running back in the NFL, but they see him as, because you can draft a running back, if it's going to be one of the first running backs drafted, that much value in draft capital would imply that maybe this guy is going to be one of the top 5 running backs in the NFL someday, or at least that's how the Seahawks view him. So then you're getting more for your money's worth. But that's one thing that I had to sort of turn around on with the running back position. And I'm curious for you, is there stuff in your research of analytics and draft capital or anything like that you've said, oh, I've been very staunchly against running backs getting drafted or getting paid a lot of money in certain, you know what I'm saying. But I've now done this research and I found out that I was wrong on something, and actually something that you've changed your opinion on. Is there anything that you could think of that you've changed your opinion on with running backs?
I don't know if I would say changed your opinion. And I definitely do agree that compared to the Giants taking Saquon Barkley at number 2, it's not nearly as unforgivable what the Seahawks did. Saquon Barkley is going to be one of the highest paid running backs in the NFL before he even takes a snap. And that's there's just really no value proposition there, especially for a team that badly needs a franchise quarterback. So it's a lot easier to criticize what the Giants did than what the Seahawks did, even though they both drafted a running back in the first round. The thing that, if I were looking for a silver lining, it's that most of the research on running backs focuses on how good they are at running the football, which makes sense because that is their primary job. But coming out now, there's a lot more running backs who are actually weapons in the receiving game. David Johnson and Alvin Kamara are a couple examples of this. And with Penny, he was actually somebody who did catch passes, both coming out of the backfield and split out wide. And while he does have issues in pass protection, the one kind of hope here is that even if we don't have reason to think that he will elevate the team with his rushing, then uh, maybe he'll be so effective in the passing game that that he'll actually be useful. And I think that's what the team was hoping for with CJ Procise. And when he was healthy in the few games, we saw how big of a difference he could make, especially in that New England game in 2016. So it seems like if the Seahawks do have a running back who is effective both as a rusher and a receiver and can stay healthy and stay on the field, then there is the potential for him to really change their offense. It's just the question um, is that a realistic expectation for a rookie running back?
Yeah, and as far as the Seahawks go and where they were at in 2017, who was their best running back last season besides Chris Carson? I think Chris Carson's sort of so far ahead of everyone else that it's an unfair question. And also just he wasn't available, for 75% of the season. So it doesn't really matter. For all the other guys, who is the best running back for the Seahawks? And how much better would they be, do you think, if the Seahawks just could have not had Eddie Lacy or Thomas Rawls? How much better would they have been if they had just found a couple replacement level guys?
So by the numbers, in terms of efficiency, J.D. McKissic was by far the most effective Seahawks running back, even counting Chris Carson as both a rusher and a receiver. So one of the problems with the Penny pick is, he's both a rusher and a receiver, but the Seahawks already had two guys in Procise and McKissic who can kind of do that. So to justify a first round pick, he has to be just leaps and bounds better than those other two guys. And yes, Procise has the health issues, but McKissic was actually kind of not bad, especially considering the offensive line he was behind. He used to be a wide receiver, so he has experience there and looked pretty good in the receiving game. He had, I think, a couple touchdown catches. So if Penny's not substantially better than McKissic as a receiver, then that would be a bit hard to stomach. But with McKissic, the problem is sample size and not knowing how he would handle kind of a fuller, large scale NFL load. While with Penny, there's the last season where he had a full-time running back load, and McKissic hasn't done that.
And the other part with Eddie Lacy and Thomas Rawls?
Yeah, if they had not given so many carries to Lacy and Rawls, and instead they had gone to or Davis. So all Lacy, Rawls, and Davis were all very, very, very negative in terms of success rate or expected points added or kind of any of these other advanced stats that we want to look at. And if you take those at face value, giving those running backs so many carries cost the Seahawks lots of points. I want to say a couple dozen points or something like that. So it's not a trivial thing. So yeah, by taking those guys out and replacing them with replacement level backs, then there would probably be some improvement. And while this is not going to happen, taking some first and 10 or second and long carries and turning those into passing plays instead would also probably help out. But this is a Pete Carroll Seahawks team, so that is probably not realistic.
Okay, so we know that the Seahawks, have made a lot of changes, firing Tom Cable, firing Darrell Bevell, adding Mike Solari, adding Brian Schottenheimer, getting, not bringing back Jimmy Graham, getting in Ed Dixon and Will Disley, who are both much more known for blocking than they are receiving and probably won't do a lot of receiving. Today they're talking to, Brandon Marshall apparently, adding Rashad Penny in the first round. Everything seems to be, getting back to that running game anyway. So with the Seahawks making all those changes and offensive line, DJ Fluker brought in, it seems like for the most part, the offensive line will look the same, which is, to me, is a pretty good thing. How much of the problem with the run game in 2017 do you think boils down to all the things that they changed? And what would be your expectation for the Seahawks to improve and move up in the rankings? I don't, in terms of running for efficiency and all that kind of stuff. If they were 31st, 32nd, 30th last year, I'm assuming it wouldn't take much for them to get into at least a territory that didn't feel that bad again.
Yeah, I think. it wouldn't take a whole lot to get them back to league average. There were so many instances where just watching going back and watching the replays of the game, there were linemen just asked to make impossible blocks. So they'd be trying to reach across and block a defensive tackle who was already past them in the backfield. And those negative plays really caused an offense in terms of expectation of getting a first down in that series or going on to score in that series. I at the end of the season, I put a piece up on field goals that people didn't really like that much, but it was a cut up of every single rushing play that went for negative yards. And going through and watching that, there's just there's so many plays where there's just nothing the running back could have done. Like they get the ball and then immediately run into one or two defenders, or as they're receiving the handoff, both the running back and Russell Wilson are getting tackled simultaneously. So if they clean that up, which maybe they can, because they'll have a new offensive line coach, and if they get, it'll be the second year for both Posick and Ifedi playing their positions. It'll be Ifedi's third season, but presumably a second season at tackle. So the hope is that experience will help some, and then having Brown and Britt to help solidify the line, and then if Fluker is a good run blocker, then maybe it'll actually be a passable run blocking line, at least compared to last season. My real concern with the offensive line is in pass protection, and we'll see how that goes.
Speaking of pass protection, Russell Wilson, last year led the NFL in touchdown passes, which feels really nice. It feels like a nice thing to say. We can ignore that Carson Wentz would have led the NFL in touchdown passes if he didn't get hurt. We can just talk about Russell Wilson, knocking up those touchdowns. But he had a career low completion percentage at 61.3%. He had a career low yards per attempt at 7.2 yards per attempt. His QBR was at 58.1. The only year he had a lower QBR was in 2016 when it was 56.8. He's still getting sacked over 40 times. As far as Russell Wilson's 2017 season goes, from an advanced standpoint, from looking at it through efficiency and everything like that, where would you rank Russell Wilson's season last year among the Russell Wilson seasons? And, I'm sure that a lot of the efficiency problems probably come from the lack of help in the running game, not having, running backs that can maybe pass protect or catch as many passes or just be a threat to run the ball or do a zone read option, something like that. Russell Wilson's efficiency in 2017. What did you think of it? And do you expect it to improve if the running game does improve?
I think it's probably the worst healthy season he's had. I don't think it's really fair to throw in 2016 because he was playing on one leg a lot. And the difficulty is disentangling the problems with play calling from the problems with pass protection to Russell Wilson's own problems. And if a quarterback is under pressure over and over and over again, do we really assign blame to him if he starts feeling phantom pressure and bailing out of the pocket early, which started to happen, especially at the end of the season. So yeah, it wasn't his best season, but he also wasn't placed in position to succeed like he was, especially in the first 4 seasons of his career. I mentioned the offensive line before, and I'm somewhat pessimistic here because if they start Fluker and Posick, those were, if you put any stock in PFF pass protecting grades or pass blocking efficiency, and we can debate how much weight we should put on them, but they were out of something like 80 guards, they were both in the bottom 5 spots, which is not in terms of pass protection, which is not encouraging. So if they don't improve and they have 2 very bad guards in pass protection and they're going against players like Aaron Donald or all the first round picks on the 49ers, then I don't know how realistic it would be to expect Russell Wilson to get better from an efficiency standpoint, especially after losing 2 of his favorite targets in Jimmy Graham and Paul Richardson.
And, we talk about offense and we talk about, the importance of, say, passing the ball or, the where running ranks and those sorts of things. Defensively, you know, the Seahawks have someone like Jaron Reed, who is an elite run stopper, but they could always use more help in pass rush. They could always, you know, they're going through a huge transition period in the secondary with Cam Chancellor and Richard Sherman. You know, we know Richard Sherman's not going to be there. Cam Chancellor, we assume, won't be there, at least in the beginning of the year. They still have Earl Thomas for now. Shaquille Griffin is going into year 2. In terms of the whole, and for me, it's just as much as important as it is to stop the quarterback on the other team, if not more important, than it is for your quarterback to have a successful day. So for the Seahawks on defense, how did you feel about their abilities to stop the pass last season? And with the changes that they've made, everything from Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill and Richard Sherman and Cam Chancellor to add, you know, it doesn't seem like there's a ton of new coming in there between, say, Barkevius Mingo and Rasheem Green, getting back Nazir Jones, adding Tom Johnson and Shamar Stephen, drafting Shaquem Griffin and you know, those sorts of things. Seahawks' ability to stop the pass. Is there anything in the offseason that has gotten you hopeful that they'll be better, or do you think they're going to be maybe a little worse?
I think it's probably reasonable to expect they'll be a little bit worse. Sheldon Richardson and Michael Bennett are both very, very good players, and not getting as much pressure on the quarterback. We know there's a strong relationship between whether a quarterback is pressured or not, and how efficient we can expect him to be on that given dropback. So if they're losing their 2 of their best 3 pass rushers, with the other one being Frank Clark, and not really replacing them, I don't think it's realistic to expect Green, as a 20-year-old rookie, to come in and be super productive in his rookie year. So even if the secondary is mostly the same as it was at the end of the year after Sherman got hurt, then if the pass rush takes a bit of a step back, then we would expect the defense to get a little bit worse. I think they finished, it was something like number 13 in DVOA defense last year, and that was with Bennett and Richardson and most of the season from Richard Sherman and Cam Chancellor playing a lot of the season. So if they're losing all those guys and not really replacing them, then it would be a lot of different players would have to take a huge step forward, which is certainly possible, but probably not the most likely thing we could expect.
And just, do you have a, you know, from 2017 season to now, do you have a favorite and least favorite move that the Seahawks have done?
Oh man, that's hard. So the least favorite move for me is definitely letting Paul Richardson walk. I think it was a mistake when they let Golden Tate walk, and Richardson is kind of their skill sets are very different, especially with Tate's running after the catch, but having a 25-year-old wide receiver who you drafted and has some chemistry with Russell Wilson, especially high pointing the balls, throwing downfield, just letting him walk for not even that expensive of a contract. I know the Seahawks want to run the ball a lot, so they probably don't value receivers as much as other teams do in the league. But their receiver depth chart is 30-year-old Doug Baldwin, Tyler Lockett, who has had injury issues, and that's basically it. So if those guys get hurt, then they're going to be in real deep trouble. My favorite move, I'm gonna have to think some about that. So I've been so pessimistic on this podcast that I feel bad, and now I can't even think of a favorite move that they've made. So I guess this is kind of a cop-out lame answer, but getting rid of Tom Cable is definitely, if there's one way that I can talk myself into having hope for this season, it's that the offensive line will play better both in the run game and the pass game, and that will be where the improvement for the team comes from, which might be wishful thinking, but here's hoping.
I find that interesting, just because, I know that it sort of feels like probably the answer most people would give, but coming from yourself, someone who's, more into analytics than hyperbole or narrative, or people just, hating on someone because it feels easy to do, to come from you, it sounds like, why do you think Tom Cable was so much a part of the problem If the Seahawks were able to successfully run and have an efficient offense from 2011 to 2015, what do you think Tom Cable changed, or do you think Tom Cable never had anything to do with anything? And I'm not disagreeing with you or putting you on the spot, or I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but just, why do you think Tom Cable was a part of the problem and not other factors?
No, that's definitely a fair question, and the real answer is that we don't know for sure, and we can't know for sure. Um, we know that the offensive line was very bad in 2017. We know that Tom Cable's specialty is supposed to be running the football, and the team hasn't been good at that since 2015. So for 2 seasons, so um, it's kind of like in some sense it's making change for change's sake rather than, at least from the outside, we can't really know if it's his fault for sure. But watching the offensive line, there's just so many mistakes that seem like easily avoidable mistakes. So a lot of the penalties, a lot of the blocks that are just impossible to make. And while we can't really know for sure if that's on the players or on Cable, and I think it was so bad in 2017 that we might as well just change it and hope for improvement.
With the 2017 season and seeing certain things go down, like the Philadelphia Eagles win the Super Bowl, 3 teams make the conference championship without a quality quarterback. The Saints, making maybe being the best team in the NFL during the regular seasons with a 2-headed running attack and Drew Brees, and improved defense. Like, with all of those things being said, if you're looking at the league-wide in 2017, and we've already seen whatever the effect will be through free agency and the draft, do you have any inclination on what to expect in 2018 in terms of team trends, schematic trends, defensive trends, players? Do you expect a lot of teams trying to do the Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara thing? Even though we know that the Saints can't do that for themselves for the first 4 games. Do you expect any trends based on what we saw last season?
It's hard to answer that. So people do point to the 4 quarterbacks who were in the championship games. So it was Bortles, Tom Brady, obviously, and then Nick Foles and Case Keenum. But Case Keenum was actually, like, legitimately, at least from an efficiency standpoint, very, very good. So maybe Keenum's not a good quarterback, but the Vikings still had good quarterback play throughout the season, if that makes any sense. So in terms of QBR, aside from the Jaguars, everyone who made the championship game was top 3 or top 5 in QBR, and that counts Wentz for the Eagles rather than Foles, since he got them a lot of the way there. And then you have the Jaguars that were largely built on pass defense. So yeah, I think it's possible that teams can point to the Saints or the turnaround from the Jaguars, thinking that Fournette had anything to do with it, which he didn't, and think that they want to win that way. But it's still, at the end of the day, it's still efficient quarterback play is what wins games, and that's even with Nick Foles and the Eagles, they got very efficient quarterback play. Now, I think the interesting question is how much teams can scheme easy throws and easy matchups for the quarterbacks, like the Eagles did with Nick Foles, and get efficient quarterback play out of quarterbacks that we don't think are elite. So what is the extent to which the system can actually elevate quarterback play, and are there things that teams could be doing, like the Eagles did, to raise the performance of their quarterbacks? And I don't really know the answer to that, but I think it's interesting to think about.
Right. And just to clarify, what I mean from the quarterbacks, from my perspective, is just more along the lines of, the Jaguars, Vikings, and Eagles all benefited just from not paying their quarterback a ton of money. And, that's it's great when they play well, too. And definitely the Jaguars, with the amount of money they were able to spend and freely bring in Calais Campbell and other guys, The Vikings, they were spending money on Sam Bradford, but surely the effect of having a quarterback and having a backup like that, just like the Eagles having a backup that they could pay $7 million or whatever it was for Nick Foles because they were only paying Carson Wentz $5 or something. Surely you still have to get that quality play in there. It's just a matter of will teams try and squeeze out that quality play out of other guys, and some of them will be forced to, just like the Eagles and Vikings were forced to do. So it'll be interesting for sure to watch that. Did you have any opinion or thoughts on those rookie quarterbacks, by the way? Anyone that you think is in the best position to succeed right away?
Of the ones just drafted, you mean?
Yeah.
This is kind of cheating because he's not technically a rookie, but I'm really interested to see what Patrick Mahomes does in Kansas City. Their system seems like it's really well set up for quarterbacks to succeed, and he might kind of add this dynamic playmaking that Alex Smith didn't really provide. As far as the actual rookie quarterbacks, I'm trying to go through the list in my head. I think Lamar Jackson's really interesting. They don't really have a lot of talent on offense, but their defense is so good. And this is the Baltimore Ravens that he could kind of be, if they actually do go with him, he could kind of step in and they could bring him along slowly, kind of like the Seahawks did in 2012 with Russell Wilson, where their defense is really good. So if they don't have to score a lot of points to win games, then there's not a lot of pressure on him right away. The Seahawks, of course, had a ton of offensive weapons around Russell Wilson that Lamar Jackson probably won't enjoy, but I think that'll be really interesting to watch. Who did Rosen get drafted by?
Who get drafted by?
Josh Rosen, the UCLA one.
Oh yeah, he went to the Cardinals.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. No, not him. Yeah, Lamar Jackson.
Are you predicting the Cardinals to be pretty bad?
Yeah. Their defense. So this is actually interesting. Their defense will probably be good again because it's somehow good every year. And if they have a good defense and if David Johnson comes back and is his normal self, then they might be not terrible. I don't even know what to think about that. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the defense is confusing. It definitely confuses the issue a little bit because I think offensively they should be the worst. I mean, then you even still have, David Johnson coming back and what's he going to look like? But I certainly think that they are 15 or 16 in the NFC at quarterback. So it's hard to imagine them, finishing in the top half of the conference. And so someone has to take those losses while other teams have quality quarterbacks. And, just Arizona's defense, it might be good, but, it might even be great, but is it enough to overcome, having a never really effective in a certain way Sam Bradford or healthy or rookie Josh Rosen? They don't have weapons on offense. They don't have an offensive line. They just so many things wrong with their offense that their defense is probably, in the same way. I could see them looking like, say, the 2011 Seahawks in that same sort of way of just, you see that there's stuff there that could work eventually or in the right place, but they're just going to be so frustrated by the offense that I don't think that they're going to win more than 4 games. So
yeah, it would not be surprising if they didn't win a division game, and if that happened, that's 0-6 right there. So then you're kind of hunting for wins for them.
And I don't know, how do you feel about the San Francisco 49ers? Because I feel like that's maybe a place of, at least for me, contention. I know, because whenever I sort of say, I can see the 49ers maybe getting 8-8, there is a harder contingent out there that sees them in the maybe the top, 3 teams in the NFC or something like that. Whereas it's nothing against Jimmy Garoppolo directly. It's more of just, well, Jimmy Garoppolo is still somewhat of a mystery. It's only been 7 games, and those wins that he got last year, I think 3 of them were very close, and this was still a team that didn't have the talent to do better than 1-10 before he started with games. And so for me, the 49ers and Seahawks came out pretty close. I think they're pretty close. And so that would bode well for the 49ers 2 years ago. But right now, them being pretty close tells me that the Seahawks and 49ers could be battling it out for that number 2, number 3 spot right up into in the division, right up until the end of the season. Maybe one of them or both of them are in contention to get the 6th seed in the NFC. But that's where I stand sort of on the 49ers. What do you think?
It's really hard. Whenever I play with efficiency stuff like expected points added or success rate or anything like that, Jimmy Garoppolo just looks outstanding, like way, way, way better than any other quarterback in the league. But like you said, it's only a 6-game sample size. And when people look at how long it takes for a quarterback's performance to kind of stabilize, it's something like thousands of pass attempts. And obviously he didn't get anywhere near that over his 6 games. So it's really hard to project. And this is also the case with Deshaun Watson. How well somebody who played phenomenally in a handful of games will play for the rest of his career. There's just such a wide range of possible outcomes that we shouldn't be surprised by that. It's really hard to know. So he could be a superstar. He could be everything that everyone says he was, or it could be an outlier and an aberration. And this is totally a cop out answer because it's really hard to take that and then put expectations on how many games they win. But I think the Rams are the clear favorite in the division, and then I think it's fair to have the Seahawks and the 49ers in the tier after that, and then the Cardinals after that, and then even though the Seahawks and 49ers are probably similar in terms of expected outcomes, I think the range for the 49ers is probably a lot wider than the Seahawks. The 49ers have a better chance of being really good and a better chance of being really bad, where the Seahawks are probably going to be similar to what they were last year.
Right. It's interesting. And I mean, it's just interesting. And either way, the NFL is such that those ranges that you talk about, it really does feel like we can look at the end of the season record and the actual way they played is much different. If you look at Football Outsiders or anything like that, there can be huge swings. And that's because so many games are, close. The Seahawks, just looking at their schedule, it's again, this is a team that for the most part has gone down to the wire in many of their games. And in many of their losses, we're very close, and that's historical back to 2012, really, middle of 2011 when they started that streak of not getting beat by more than a touchdown. So there can be huge swings, like last year, beating the 49ers 12-9, losing to the Titans by 6, beating the Rams by 6, beating the Texans by 3, losing to the Redskins by 3, beating the Cardinals by 6, losing to the Falcons by 3. So many close games in there, finally losing to the Cardinals by 2, that it can swing one way or the other. Is there any sort of for you, is what do you prefer to go to from an analytics standpoint for teams? Does DVOA reign supreme? Is there flaws with DVOA? Is it something else? What do you think?
In terms of so if you want something very, very simple, then I think point differential it's very simple and gets you most of the way there. And the rule of thumb is that I think it's a win is 31 points. So if a team has a point differential of plus 31, then we'd expect them to be a 9-7 team. So one win better than average. And that's about what the Seahawks were last year. So they won 9 games, and their underlying point differential was the 9-win team. So their record was what they should have been. If you want to get a little more fancy, I also like ELO, which is on 538. So they have their projections. And the nice thing about ELO is that it updates right after games. So you can look at their site, and a team gets a rating. And if they win games, their rating goes up. If they lose games, their ratings goes down. And then it tells you based on the rating that a team has, a team's percent chances of winning or making the playoffs and winning the division and making the Super Bowl and all these kinds of things. You mentioned DVOA, and it's also good. And it, when people looked at it, it also does well at predicting how well a team will do going forward. So if a team has if it's in the middle of the season and a team has kind of a decent record but really good DVOA, then chances are that team is actually better than its record does. The just from a convenience standpoint, the downside of that is that you have to wait until Tuesday night when they actually publish the new DVOA rankings from a season. But over the offseason, looking ahead of a season, the Football Outsiders Almanac publishes their kind of expected wins for a team and breaks down here's how likely this team is to be a Super Bowl contender. Here's how likely this team is to be pretty good. Here's how likely this team is to be competing for the top spot in the draft. So that's kind of a nice way to look at teams going into the season. So that was a very long-winded answer, but there's a lot of stuff that's pretty good. And I probably spend the most time on the 538 site, the ELO projections, and
Gotcha.
same for NBA too. Their projections are fun for that.
Gotcha. And I'm curious to run through a few more analytics questions. Like, what do you wish there was more data on for the perspective of trying to understand football? What do you think would be nice to have more data on? And is it something that's, like, say, even feasible to do right now?
One thing that is beginning to gain a little bit of traction is numbers advantage in the box, especially for run games. So a lot of what predicts how well a team does when it hands the ball off is whether they have a blocker's advantage. So if there's as many blockers as defenders in the box, if that's the case, we would expect a successful run. If there's more defenders than offensive linemen, then we'd expect not a successful run. And getting more data on that, I think, would help us do a better job of figuring out which running backs are actually good. Because if a running back is just asked to run into a stacked box where there's more defenders than blockers over and over again, then their efficiency numbers aren't going to look good, but it's unclear whether or not that's actually the running back's fault if they're put into this bad situation over and over again. So that's one thing. Another thing I wish that would be included in the public data is play action information. I've gotten some access to that and done some work with it, but it's not something that the public gets access to, which is kind of too bad because I think it's pretty important, and play action passes are more efficient than non-play action passes. So they're one of the most efficient plays in the game, if not the most efficient play in the game. But combing through the public play-by-play data, you can't get any idea of when teams are actually using it.
And what would you say is maybe a stat, if it's advanced or not, that is used a lot, that is frustratingly overrated?
I think for running backs, yards per carry is basically useless. It has basically no correlation to how well a team does. And if you try to use a team's yards per carry running to predict in one point of the season to try to predict how well they'll do in other parts of the season, there's basically no relationship. So I think for the running game, I'm becoming more convinced that we should just be using success rate, which is just the number of successful carries divided by the number of non-successful carries. And you can define success in a number of different ways. The simple one is whether you gain 5 yards on 1st and 10, whether you gain 60% of the yardage needed on 2nd down, or if you get a 1st down on 3rd or 4th down. So if you just take that, then you can do a much better job of predicting how good a team is using their run game alone, which is something you can't say about yards per carry. So I'm pretty much done with yards per carry.
Do you know who was number 1 in success rate last season?
Among all players, it was Cam Newton, and that is probably partially inflated because it's easier to get a success on 3rd and 4th down if it's in short yardage, because you only need to get a yard or something. So the league average conversion rates on 3rd and 4th down are much higher because rushing is actually that's one of the situations where rushing is actually more successful. Off the top of my head, if I had to guess,
I have the running backs ahead of me, so it's not necessarily a quiz. I'm just more like a rhetorical question. And then
if you're looking at the Football Outsiders list, that's somewhat different. So there's a lot of different definitions of success rate. When I was looking at this was whether this is the percent of plays that had positive expected points added, which is very, very slightly and annoyingly different than the Football Outsiders definition, but they should be highly correlated. My guess would be Dion Lewis, but I'm not sure if that's right.
It's close. The number one is still a New England Patriot. It's Mike Gillislee.
Okay.
But Mike Gillislee, obviously, it's a smaller percentage of carries, but as long as you hit 100 rushes, it seems to qualify. And clearly, there were other huge differences between him and Dion Lewis. Like Dion Lewis led the NFL in DER and in second in DVOA, and Gillislee was 26th because just didn't have any many carries, but also 20th in DVOA. It's huge swings and differences there. And then number two was Ezekiel Elliott, and number 3 was Peyton Barber. And number 4 was Dion Lewis. Number 5 was Todd Gurley. Number 6 was Alvin Kamara. Anyway, number 7 was Alfred Morris. Now, one of the things that I'm seeing with this that could be a problem would be offensive line and scheme and team, because we see Alfred Morris and Ezekiel Elliott in the top 7. We see Dion Lewis and Mike Gillislee in the top 7. We see Peyton Barber in here for some reason. With those sorts of things, like is anything here with Football Outsiders predictive, or is it just like, no, these were the situations last year, they were very efficient because we're concerned about efficiency, we're not concerned about predictability? Or is it predictive of something else? Can we expect, hey, Peyton Barber did well here, maybe next season he'll be a sleeper?
So I've only looked at this at the team level, and so what I was doing was something that Football Perspective has done a lot, where you take 8 games, you randomly select 8 games from a season, and you try to use information those 8 games to predict how many games the team wins in the other half sample in the other 8 games. And the correlation between rushing success rate and point differential in the other 8 games was something like 0.2 to 0.25, which isn't that big. Partially because running really isn't that important, but it's a lot bigger than the correlation for yards per carry, which is why I kind of started being down on yards per carry. If you compare that to passing success rate or passing EPA per play, that's almost twice as big. So kind of any statistical analysis you do where you try to predict the wins, passing is always going to be much, much more important. But at least for rushing success rate, the correlation isn't 0 or close to 0. So, yeah, it's not a great measure if you're trying to figure out how good a team is going to be. And yes, it absolutely depends on how good a team's offensive line is and whether they put their running backs in position to succeed. So, yeah, we should probably think about this more as a team stat than a player stat, which I think was your point, and I definitely agree with. Alex Collins is a good example of this, where he was not super successful in Seattle. He's still the same player, and then was pretty successful in Baltimore. But if you have a team that can have successful rushing, then it can help your team.
Yeah, I mean, with Football Outsiders, like one of the guys that I have been cautiously pessimistic about, I don't know if that's a phrase, but is Jordan Howard, because it seems like he's a guy who, yes, has put up 2,400 yards in his first two seasons. As you mentioned, 5.2 yards per carry. As you mentioned, not necessarily that good of a, like, it's good. I mean, it shows that he gained 5.8 yards per carry, and the Bears did. But when you look at something like success rate, he sticks out quite a bit because he's the only guy in the top 10 that doesn't have a decent success rate. 42%, ranks 35th. Leonard Fournette, is a guy who ranks 26th in success rate. There are other examples, but Jordan Howard, Leonard Fournette, like, can you see the way of like being cautious about players because of success rate, or being cautious about players because of offensive line? Like Jordan Howard, his situation, it seemed like playing behind Josh Sitton and that interior offensive line was so good that maybe some of these guys, if you're looking for players to maybe stay away from, not from a fantasy perspective, but first from like a football perspective, do you see those guys on the other side of the coin that may be a little overrated?
Yeah, if somebody has high yards per carry and low success rate, that's definitely a red flag. Yards per carry is very sensitive to long runs, which are probably uh, to a large degree just randomness. Whether or not a player breaks a really long run is it's very much a product of circumstance. So if somebody has a low success rate, then um, we can't know if that's because of the player himself or because of the offensive line or play calling or whatever. But um, that does tell us that in the carries that they get, they are consistently uh, not making the offense more likely to score, and that which is basically what success rate is measuring. So success rate measures uh, on a given play, are you more likely to score after the play than you were before the play? And if you have a low success rate, that means that you are repeatedly making the offense less likely to score. And this is why the Seahawks were so problematic. They had several backs with a success rate in the order of 30% on early downs, and it's just so hard to score if you are losing ground so consistently like that.
Yeah. Finally, Ben, let's close it out. We've talked about the Seahawks and changes, and we've talked about some of the other teams in the NFC and the NFC West, and we've talked about sort of analytics, of course, and advanced stats. Where we're at right now with the Seahawks. I'm sure you've played around with the EPA and played around with the numbers and tried to find maybe the best and worst case scenarios. So, given the circumstances right now, we can look at the Seahawks and, personally see a lot of change both on offense and defense and in coaching. I think there are obviously things that you can point to positively, like Russell Wilson and, maybe the fact that the offensive line will be upgraded with Dwayne Brown. The fact that the defense still has right now Earl Thomas and Frank Clark and Jaron Reed and Shaquille Griffin and Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright, quality players that gives them, I think, a talent perspective of being somewhere in the middle of the road, if not in the top 5 of the NFC. I think talent-wise, you could say that the potential is there for them to be that, and that Russell Wilson has the potential to be the MVP in the entire league. But there are also all of the downsides that we've seen. So what do you see with the Seattle Seahawks and your expectations as of, May 9th, 2018?
Right now, the betting markets have Seattle as an 8-win team, which feels about right. As I mentioned before, they went 9-7 last year, and that's what all their underlying measures told us they should have gone. And then they lost a bunch of talent. They lost both Richardsons and Jimmy Graham and Michael Bennett. So take their nine-win team and subtract a win for their losses, and you get 8 wins, which feels about right. I'm guessing that I don't have any inside knowledge on this, but I'm guessing the Football Outsiders projection will be somewhere around there. So if the Seahawks won somewhere between 7 and 9 games next year, I wouldn't be surprised with anything in that range of outcomes. If they won fewer than 7 games or more than 9 games, I think I'd be pretty surprised. Unless the caveat here, which is kind of a cop out, is that if the offensive line is significantly elevated and Russell Wilson can go back to what he was doing at the end of 2015 and has time to throw, then I could see the team being better than that. But that's kind of the only path that I can see that happening, where Russell Wilson really becomes the MVP candidate that we think he can be.
And so if they go 9-7, how many games back of the Rams would you say that puts them? And do you see the Rams as the best team in the NFC, if not the NFL?
Yeah, I think 10 or 11 games is probably a reasonable expectation for the Rams. The one thing with them is that they were so healthy last year, by far the healthiest team in the league. And if they had some regression in health along their offensive line or in Todd Gurley or their receivers, then it's kind of a question mark how Jared Goff would react. How would he play if he didn't have outstanding pass protection throughout a whole season? So it could come collapsing down, but I think in kind of the most frequent scenario, I would expect them to win double digit games.
There you go, Ben Baldwin, The Athletic. Ben, where can people find you, and what would you like them to know about The Athletic?
I can be found on Twitter at Guga31BB. I just started at the Athletic a week ago. Uh, they asked me if I wanted to write about the Seahawks. And I knew pretty much nothing about the Athletic except that Sheil Kapadia, who used to cover the Seahawks for ESPN and is now at the Athletic for covering the Eagles, I knew that he worked there, so that was pretty much all the information I needed to say yes before really knowing anything. Um, but the idea is that it's a subscription service, so there is a fee you have to pay, but once you pay, then there's no advertisements, there's no autoplay videos. You can read about any of the cities that the Athletic covers. So if you don't like my stuff, you can go read Sheila's stuff on the Eagles, which is excellent. You can read about the Bay Area teams. Their Golden State Warriors coverage is really good, which is actually why I signed up in the first place a long time ago. So I think it's pretty exciting, and hopefully other people will enjoy the content there.
Absolutely. There you have it. This is Kenneth Arthur. You can follow us on Twitter at Field Goals. Obviously, check out fieldgoals.com. Support The Athletic for Seattle. And, they're doing great stuff there. And, friend of the show, Stephen Cohen, working there now and bringing in the great Ben Baldwin to cover the Seahawks and advanced stats. And a pleasure to have you on the show this week. For all of you listening out there, you can subscribe to this show on iTunes by finding Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur, and that'll bring in all of the shows that I mentioned at the top of the episode. This has been this week's Seahawks Chats. Whatever comes next, I have no clue.